Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. I'm Dr. Elliott Dennis, Assistant Professor and Livestock Marketing Specialist with the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. This webinar is part of our Extension Farm and Ranch Management Team's weekly webinar series. For a complete listing of past recordings and upcoming future events, please go to farm.unl.edu. Before we begin our webinar, we'd also like to point out that the Nebraska Rural Response Hotline remains a great resource for agriculture professionals across the state and provides mental health counseling, information regarding legal assistance, financial clinics, mediation, and much more. The hotline's toll-free number is 1-800-464-0258, and they also have a wealth of resources related to stress and wellness at ruralwellness.unl.edu. Today, the webinar will be focused on a potential new policy on animal ID and traceability that has been proposed by USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, commonly known as APHIS. And we're going to discuss its possible implications for producers and specifically focus on some new research that's come out that has estimated how much producers are willing to pay for a mandatory or voluntary traceability program. To discuss this webinar with us today, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. James Mitchell, an Assistant Professor of Livestock Marketing and Management at the University of Arkansas, and Dr. Brian Vander Ley, Assistant Professor and Veterinary Epidemiologist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. To begin, we're going to welcome Dr. Vander Ley, who is a veterinary epidemiologist at UNL's Great Plains Veterinary Educational Center. And his primary goals is to enhance the success of cattle producers and their veterinarians through research and education focused on improving animal health. Welcome to the webinar, Brian, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'll share my screen here in a minute. You can just confirm that you can see the slides, Dr. Dennis?
Yeah, that's great, Brian.
All right, great, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be able to introduce this topic, and give me one. Thank you. All right, I'm in not in my normal office today, so you might hear just a little background noise, and I apologize for that. But it's a pleasure to introduce this topic, and my goal today is to set up the idea of animal disease traceability and tell you just a little bit about what I know about how it works. I know there's some people on the call today that have a lot more information, and they can provide a lot more details than I can. So if the folks at Nebraska Department of Ag and USDA are definitely the resource on this. But so I'm going to start out by just trying to describe why disease traceability is important, and this kind of gets to the heart of the recent APHIS regulations and guidelines that are going to be talked about more. I think the one that we usually think about first is that international trade is contingent upon being free of disease that is important to livestock production in other countries. In other words, we have to be disease-free in order to participate. So if we have foot and mouth disease or African swine fever or a long list of other diseases, it puts us on puts us in a situation where other countries are not going to import our livestock products and risk contracting those diseases themselves. And we do that here in the US to other countries as well. There's trade barriers that are in place because of diseases that other countries experience. Another really important piece of disease traceability is prompt containment of disease outbreaks to protect critical livestock agriculture. And this really has, in my opinion, it's got three fundamental parts to it. So if our livestock agriculture is critical for food security in the US, if we're going to have enough food, especially enough protein to feed the population of the US, we need livestock agriculture in play, and a massive foreign animal disease outbreak is very detrimental to that. Economic security, agriculture is a huge part of the US economy, and any any upsets in that can have some important ramifications within the agricultural community and outside of it. And then there's a lot of implications for foreign animal disease outbreaks, and even non foreign animal disease, program diseases like tuberculosis and scrapie, chronic wasting disease, et cetera, that have some important implications for animal health and well-being. And one thing that we also need to remember is that human health is also a major priority for traceability. The best example of that is current is tuberculosis that's circulating in the US in a couple of places. So that control effort is largely aimed at protecting human health as much as it is at minimizing the trade barriers and disease and implications for agriculture. So disease traceability is not disease prevention, but it is rapid containment. And this is a really simple schematic for how disease traceability works. So what we want to be able to do in a disease outbreak is quickly identify the index case. So the red circle kind of in the middle, the one that's labeled 0. We can think about that being the first case of a disease that shows up. And disease traceability is all about quickly figuring out one, where it came from. So that's trace backs. So that's looking at the herds that fed livestock or contact into the index case and figuring out where it might have come from until we find the source. And even more importantly is finding out where the disease went. So trace forward to quickly contain the spread and make sure that we limit that, and in doing so limit the impact of that disease on the things I mentioned before. So how is tracing done right now for cattle? It's based on a collection of different documents and tools. So certificates of veterinary inspection are important. Some of these are handwritten still, some of them are electronic. Program disease records. So program diseases in the US for cattle are mainly going to be brucellosis and tuberculosis. So bangs vaccination or calf hood vaccination forms serve as a spot where cattle show up, so to speak, in the traceability chain. They get officially ID'd and there's a record of where they were and when they were there. And then points of sale, so market records and some of the activities like back tagging that happen at markets. And brand inspection records can also be part of doing tracing. The problem with current tracing now is that it's historically dependent on the newest tags or the metal clip tags. So these would be the orange metal bangs tags or the silver bright tags. Because a lot of it is dependent on handwritten records, there's a lot of recording and transposition errors. And it's complicated in some cases by a lack of compliance. So people will move cattle in basically an illegal way, move them across state lines without appropriate documentation, or lots of other things that basically break the chain of traceability. And probably most importantly is this process is it can be very slow. Recently, there was a TB outbreak in South Dakota that involved a number of herds. I think it was 12 states and quite a few herds in each state that traced back and forward from that herd. And it took them 10 months to sort out that tracing situation. So tuberculosis is a slow moving insidious disease. If that were a disease of short incubation, it would have been everywhere before they even got started. So USDA recently published some new guidance for animal disease traceability, and with that they included some goals. And I'll let you read these in detail yourself. You can go to their website or you can read these as I talk about them a little bit. But the basic premise of these goals is to improve the efficiency of disease traceability by switching to a electronic identification system with automatic electronic storage of the information, so it's easily accessible, in order to create a system that can actually catch up to a disease quickly before it goes out of control and creates the damage to our trade relationships, to our economic and livestock health, and in some cases to human health. So The USDA has, one of the primary points of this has been the move to electronic identification, which I think is a big part of today's presentation. And they opened up a comment period in late 2020 based on an executive order signed by President Trump to avoid, basically the way I understood it, to avoid quick changes in the system. And they got a lot of comments, and those are still being summarized and considered. But in some conversations with animal health officials here in Nebraska, the idea is that we're still probably going to be moving toward electronic ID as the official ID. The timeline looks to be similar, but that's a little bit up for debate yet. So that's my introduction, and I'll turn it over. I'll turn it back to Dr.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Now to some of that conversation that's been happening has been, some of this, do producers actually want this? And some of the comments are mixed if you go on the docket. So we're going to have Dr. Mitchell, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness, and his recent work has focused a lot on biosecurity and foreign animal disease with specific ties to traceability and identification. He's going to talk through a little bit of some of the work that he's done on trying to determine about mandatory versus voluntary ability to pay for this. And just turn that time over to Dr. Mitchell.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Dr. Dennis. Let me share my slides here. Happy to be talking with everyone this afternoon. So more broadly, I am an economist, and so I like to think that I can explain almost anything using economics. Some could debate that, but that's what we're going to try and do today, and answer a few questions with regards to is there any value in these types of traceability systems to cattle producers here in the U.S. So Dr. Vander Ley did an excellent job, I think, kind of summarizing where we are today with traceability. But something that I kind of struggled with when I first started thinking about traceability, and I think it's important that we all realize this as kind of a piece of motivating background information, is realizing that there really isn't a one-type-fits-all traceability system, right? So even within cattle, cattle traceability in Australia looks different from cattle traceability in Canada, which is going to look different from cattle traceability here in the United States. And part of that is realizing that traceability in itself really isn't the end goal, right? So just because we have a traceability system in the US, that's not really the end point. What really is what we're trying to do is we're trying to use traceability as a tool to accomplish a specific goal in mind, right? So I've got two examples listed here. The two most prominent examples of this are for cattle traceability in the US. The two main objectives that many of us have been talking about are using traceability for disease surveillance, control, eradication. That's what we're going to be talking about mainly today. But there's also the other objective of marketing and verifying what's called credence attributes. And what do I mean by that? So marketing and credence, a credence attribute is any attribute that you can't observe by looking at a product, right? So origin, for example, is like a credence attribute. There might be some very skilled people on the call today, but certainly I can't go to a pen of steers and to tell you whether that pen of steers is from Kansas or if they're from Nebraska, right? We need to be able to verify that. That's verifying a credence attribute. It could also be verifying something like a VAC 45 claim, for example. I can't look at a pen of cattle and tell you if they're VAC 45 cattle, if they're VAC 34 cattle. So being able to verify credence attributes is really the other driving force behind cattle traceability in the U.S. There is significant debate with regards to whether these two objectives can coexist in a cattle traceability system in the United States. And a lot of what Dr. Vander Ley was talking about with why traceability is important really the fundamental factors that change the meat marketplace are what give rise to these objectives and ultimately determine what traceability is going to look like, right? So increased globalization, lends itself to really heightening the importance of disease traceability, right? So we've seen the case of African swine fever in China. We've seen other disease examples where traceability really is an important thing to talk through. With regards to the second objective, as cattle in the U.S. become more differentiated, certainly a need there to be able to verify some of these things that I call credence attributes. And I should say, kind of next then would be determining what kind of agreement do we have with regards to how traceability should be used in the U.S. So something that I did a couple of years ago was I surveyed cattle producers in the United States, so cow-calf producers and feedlot producers about traceability. So we're going to be talking about some of that work here in a moment. One of the things I asked was, in designing a national traceability system for cattle in the U.S., what kind of objectives, what things do you think are critical towards identifying or towards developing a traceability system? First being able to manage disease. In general, you can see among these two groups of producers in the U.S., there seems to be general agreement with regards to the importance of being able to manage disease, right? So 87% of cow-calf producers think that managing disease is important or very important for traceability. Likewise, 83% of feedlots would agree that it's important and very important. Enhancing marketability, again, you see the same type of agreement, right? So once the industry agrees on an objective, we can move forward with developing a traceability system. And here's where we get towards the economics of this, right? So Dr. Vander Ley kind of talked about some of the, how does traceability work? And one of the hangups here is, compliance. So we can have a traceability system in the US, like the animal disease traceability framework that APHIS has been working on. But really for that to work, we need people to be participating in it, right? So we can have a really nice, neat, cool traceability framework, but in order for disease traceability to work, you really need to have people that are participating in it. And I'm sure there's epidemiologists and vets that can speak more to this, but what do I mean by this? Well, the general idea is if you've got X% of people enrolled in a cattle traceability framework, then effectively you can trace X% of the beef herd, right? So that's what I mean by that. And if we really want to understand how do we get to a place where we have significant participation in cattle traceability, then we really need to start thinking about what's the value of these systems to producers in the US, right? So traceability, participation, compliance is not free. There's costs and benefits associated with it. Well, what are the costs? Well, obviously there's tag costs, there's processing costs, there's management costs, there's having the software, for example, if you're using, radio frequency identification tags. A bit more tricky then is thinking through what's the value, what's the benefit of this stuff for us. And what the real big problem in economics that we think about is traceability is a scenario where the public incentive to have it is significantly larger than the private incentives for people to participate. What do I mean? So everybody in the United States benefits from food safety, regardless if they're helping to supply that, right? So everyone in the US benefits from having safe food. Cattle producers are the ones doing the work to help make sure that food is safe. Traceability is part of ensuring that we have a safe food system, right? So we've got this huge public benefit of having food safety, but the costs of doing so are only allocated to a smaller segment of the population, cattle producers. So what's the solutions? If we have, let's say, animal disease traceability in the US, and we need people to participate in this so that we can effectively manage disease if it occurs, what are the solutions to making us have, nationally significant participation? Well, there's a few options here. Option one is mandates. So mandating traceability, definitely not ideal. I'm certainly not a proponent of mandating really anything with regards to this stuff. There's lots of inefficiencies with mandating something like traceability. There's anticipated and unanticipated consequences of that type of policy. So if we're not going to mandate it, what are the other solutions to getting us to a place where we do have effectively X% of the cattle herd that is traceable, where there's a few other alternatives. So we've got the animal disease traceability framework with APHIS. We can tweak the design of that program. We can kind of focus in on what are the benefits and costs of this to producers and adjust those. We can think through what attributes are attractive to producers using these types of systems. For example, one attribute of traceability is what type of ID system are we going to use? The current one proposed is eventually transitioning towards EID. That's an attribute. So if we're not going to mandate something, well, then let's think about how can we adjust the framework to align with incentives and really hone in on what's the value of this stuff to the industry. I spoke to the costs of this stuff. So adopting it isn't free. There's managerial costs. There's physical costs of tags and electronic readers. It's a little bit trickier to think through the benefits of traceability, right? So there's large scale benefits. So the industry would benefit from, maintaining, trade markets. But again, that's a huge benefit to the industry. It's not clear what the benefit is to the individual cattle producer who is actually doing the work of adopting traceability and make sure that we can manage this stuff efficiently. One benefit that we can think through, and this was probably one of the bigger comments that I would expect USDA got with regards to the current traceability proposal, and that is we can think through traceability as being an attribute of cattle, right? So much like a VAC 45 claim, cattle that enroll in a traceability program are different from cattle that are not enrolled in a traceability program, right? So that's a source of product differentiation. The question there is, okay, well, is traceability valued by others in the beef cattle supply chain, right? Are there premiums that cattle can garner by being attached to one of these traceability programs? The big critical part to this is if there are premiums for traceability that producers can receive, obviously, if we mandated a specific technology or a specific type of traceability, those premiums would disappear because there's no longer a source of product differentiation. If all cattle in the US have to be involved in traceability or have to use a specific identification technology, then those premiums for doing so are no longer there. Instead, we might only have, fines for not doing so. I'm not speaking to the bright side of mandates. I'm telling you that if premiums exist, they would no longer exist under a mandatory framework. So the question I want to ask is, what's the value of traceability? That's the title of this webinar. That's the question I want to answer for us today. Naturally, if you're a cattle producer and you're thinking about traceability in the future, you're probably naturally thinking about, okay, what's this going to cost for me to actually participate? And are there any benefits for me doing so? This is one benefit that I want to talk through this afternoon. For example, again, going back to some of that survey work I was talking to. So I asked cow-calf operations, what would it cost you to participate in a traceability program that uses RFID tags? So EID, radio frequency identification, right? How much do you think it costs you to participate in something like that? Of the 220 operations that responded to my inquiries, only 3.6% said it costs less than $1 to do this, all the way up towards we have 30% of respondents that think it's going to cost me, $13 or more per head to participate in traceability. Economics tells us that we're not going to do that unless we can recover that cost, right? So there has to be a return to doing this. Otherwise, it's just a cost that's lost and we don't receive a benefit from doing so. I asked the question, is there premiums for cow-calf operations participating in this type of stuff? So the next thing that I did was I asked feedlots, Suppose you're receiving cattle in your feedlot. Would you be willing to pay cow-calf producers or cattle producers a premium so that you could receive loads of cattle that had an RFID technology and were participating in traceability? And so what did I find? Of the 151 feedlots that responded to the survey, I found that 45, almost half of the respondents said they would be willing to pay less than $1 per head to receive cattle with RFID that are participating in a traceability system. So there's a few caveats to that, right? So I would suspect, a lot of people probably, when they receive cattle at a feed yard, they probably re-tag a lot of stuff anyway. So there's not necessarily a benefit from the RFID part, but there's certainly a benefit towards, having that information flow back to the cow-calf producer instead of stopping with the feedlot. So this is what we find in terms of what feedlots would be willing to pay for this stuff. What's the problem? Cow-calf producers are saying they need $16 per head. 30% are saying more than $13 per head. Feedlots, roughly 50% are saying they're willing to pay less than $1, right? So we've got a big discrepancy here. What are ways that we can use to kind of make up that gap? And there's a few alternatives that I consider. So what do I do? So this is my guiltless plug of some research I've been working on with Glenn Tonser at K-State, Lee Schultz at Iowa State. Basically what we did was, let's consider a hypothetical traceability program that's similar to the program that Dr. Vander Ley was summarizing for us, the APHIS system. So let's say we're talking about a hypothetical traceability program where cattle are using EID or RFID, same thing, so radio frequency identification. So let's assume we're thinking about a traceability system with RFID. What aspects of that traceability program do we need to adjust such that there's more value to everyone in the industry, right? So the way this is set up, we're asking cow-calf producers, what aspects of traceability are valuable to you? And if we change that part of traceability, would you be more willing to participate in it? Likewise, we're going to ask feedlots, okay, we've got this traceability system in the US. What aspects of it do we need to change to get you to participate and value it? So this is what we've got on the first graph I have put up for you. So I've got premiums for cattle that are enrolled in a traceability system with RFID, and cow-calf producers are in the blue line, feedlots are the red line. So the way you would interpret this is for a $10 per head premium, X% of cow-calf producers would be willing to participate in that type of system. Likewise, there's a certain percentage of feedlots that would be willing to participate in this type of traceability system. This black dot here is the intersection where X% of cow-calf producers are willing to participate in this type of traceability framework, and X% of feedlots are willing to procure cattle and place them in their feedlot who are participating in this type of traceability program. This intersection is at 42% and $4.08 per head. So this is a per head premium. You would interpret this as saying 40% of cow-calf producers in the US and 42% of feedlots in the US would be willing to participate in a traceability program that involves using RFID. Useful to know that, right? That tells cow-calf producers that yes, there's potential to garner premiums from enrolling in a system like we've just discussed. This technology is the technology that APHIS is saying we eventually want to transition to. So we've got ourselves to 42% participation for both groups of individuals with a $4.08 per head premium for those cattle. So what are some other things that we can adjust to a traceability program to get us to a more significant or higher rate of participation among cattle producers in the US? The next thing I considered was a part of traceability is not only the type of technology we're using, it's also who's managing the data that we are tracking using traceability, right? So another one of the big concerns that I think were voiced pretty loudly by people was there's definitely a concern of confidentiality with regards to the data that we're actually going to be tracking in this system. So I asked producers, okay, let's consider a specific traceability program with RFID, and let's see how much we value as an industry the person who's actually managing the data. So on the left, we've got percent enrollment and the dollar per head premium for a traceability framework where the federal government is managing all of the traceability data. On the right, we've got a traceability program where the data is managed through what I call a government private industry partnership, right? So the way we described it, this type of scenario, this would be a traceability program where there's a board of directors who manage the data, have oversight of the data. These are going to be participants or individuals in the cattle industry. Those individuals ultimately have oversight of the data and determined when that data that's tracked using traceability can be accessed for disease tracing purposes. And again, we have the premium for that type of program on the y-axis. So effectively, what's the difference between these two graphs? Basically, by just changing who's managing the traceability program, we've effectively shifted both of these two curves to the right. So what do I mean by that? So at a $0 per head premium, you get roughly 30% of producers, or less than that, willing to participate in a system that's managed by the government. By allowing for a traceability program to be managed by a government private industry partnership, we've shifted that whole thing to the right such that we get at a $0 per head premium, more than 50% of feedlots would be willing to participate in that. The intersection is 40% of both groups would participate at a $9.52 per head premium. But in general, the take-home conclusion from this is that something as fundamental as determining how we're actually going to manage traceability has a significant impact on its value to feedlots and on the ability for producers to get paid for doing this. The next adjustment that we could consider, and this is something that's actually already happened in the US, was let's consider a cost share policy. So let's consider a traceability program where the tags are provided to producers at half cost or for free. This is something I haven't made up. So I think for like the National Scrapie Eradication Program for sheep, for example, they were giving away tags at zero cost to producers to participate in that. With regards to the current cattle traceability system, I'm not sure if this is national or not, but I saw reading a few days ago that the state health officials for Oklahoma, for example, we're going to be providing free tags to cattle producers to participate in this stuff. And so again, this is a traceability system that uses RFID technology, dollar per head premium for doing so on the y-axis, participation on the bottom here. And these different dots reflect the percent cost share. So blue is cow-calf producers enrolling in this type of system, but they pay all of the costs of doing so. The red line is that they only pay 50% of the tag cost, and the green line is that those tags are provided to cattle producers at no cost. And again, it intuitively makes sense. If you decrease the costs of participating, you're shifting this curve to the right. And so for a traceability program in the US where these tags are applied at no cost, you get an intersection of 50% of both groups of individuals are willing to participate in this at a $1.92 per head premium, right? So again, highlighting the idea that there are ways to adjust the specifics of traceability to get us to a place of national significance in terms of being able to effectively and quickly respond to disease events. Just the take-home points of all of this, there's opportunities for cattle to garner premiums by being enrolled in traceability systems. these premiums would disappear under a scenario where traceability is mandatory. Why? Because if every animal in the US is enrolled in this, then there's no longer a price differential. There's no longer a premium of doing so. And then things like cost share policies, which are things that we've already done in the US, can certainly help us on the cost side. And then simply by partnering with the industry as a middle ground in terms of managing the system, again, shows us that there's significant value in that type of consideration. So that's what I've got for us this afternoon. So I'd love to hear from the audience. And I think we're all going to tackle some questions together as I understand it. So thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks, James. I'm going to go ahead and just open it up for comments and Q&A. If you have questions, either type it in the chat box or the Q&A. And while you guys are doing so, I'm just going to go ahead and just share a few slides just so that we have a just kind of basic understanding of where the APHIS policy is at, and also kind of what's current adoption rate of these certain tags. So while you guys are doing that, I'll just go ahead and share real quick, and we'll go ahead. Is this good, James? I think you're muted there.
All of your slides cut off, I think.
Okay.
Or no, it's, yeah, it is.
Okay. Go ahead and, how's that?
There we go.
Okay. Just so everyone's aware, I mean, this is, Brian was talking about the APHIS timeline. This first kind of came into discussion in 2019. Prior to the comment period, APHIS had put out that they were going to, starting in January of 2021, they were no longer going to be providing these free metal ear tags. With the comment period, that's my understanding, that's been delayed a little bit. And then kind of where that's going is in 2023, they're going to be moving away that in order for animals to transfer from state to state, they will have to have the RFID tag. It's also important to note that feeder cattle and animals that are moving directly from to slaughter within the state don't require that RFID tag. This was a study that was recently done by Martin from Colorado State, and they basically asked, what is the current adoption rate for these tags? And what they found was that metal ear tags, of course, are the ones that are most commonly used. And they looked at, well, if you participate in beef quality assurance program, really you're more likely to use some form of electronic identification. So what was this comes from the National Animal Health Monitoring System survey that was done in 2011, and they asked feedlots, when cattle are arriving in operations, what's the percent of animals that arrive with an EID tag? And really what we see is the larger the feedlot is, the more animals that will come in, more animals will require an EID tag. But the overall percent of cattle is generally less. For example, if a feedlot operation has a one-time head capacity between 1 head and 499 head, 36% of the feedlots receive cattle with EID tags, and roughly 36% of the cattle in the feedlot at one time have EID tags. So what generally happens, cattle come in, as James was saying, and did they just re-tag them? Or how are they managing? Is it actual individual ID or is it lot ID? And this shows you kind of the comparison between what feedlots were doing in 1999 towards 2011. And across both individual animal ID and what we consider pen ID has increased, about 15% for the individual animal ID and about 10% for a group for pen level ID. that kind of gives us an idea of what's happening in the feedlot right now, what's happening from a cow-calf producer, and kind of what that APHIS timeline is going to be. So let's just start to answer some of these questions that have come in. We'll continue to answer these. So feel free to continue to put those in the comments as we begin. One question says, I've used the ID tags for years, and bangs I've tags instead of the metal tags. Over the past 3 years, I only find a 70% retention rate. Is there a more permanent ID system? And we'll have Brian answer that question.
That's a good observation, that retention is really important. So you're kind of trapped in between the metal tags, which have really good retention, but are pretty limited in terms of traceability function. And it's also the stuff that Dr. Mitchell talked about is harder to, it's just a lot more work to use a metal tag that you have to read, which usually means you have to clean it first and use that to try to take advantage of the premiums associated with tracing cattle. The quest for a better retention is ongoing, and I think what we'll see in the coming years is that, as there's a lot of discussion about switching from what are called low frequency tags, which are the ones that we have now, the button tags, to high frequency tags, which is part of some of the systems that are up and coming, like cattle trace, are using more high frequency. The high frequency tags offer a lot of options to put them into different formats that they're working on that I think will improve retention. But the shortest answer is it's a work in progress.
Thanks, Dr. Vander Ley. This question is for you, James. How would premiums work in places that are would be separate from major cattle feeding areas? So question reference New England. There's no large feedlots, there's no large cow-calf producers. So how are those premiums going to be paid potentially in markets that are more distant from cattle feeding operations?
Good question. Let me think out loud about that one. So it ultimately, I guess, so we use the feedlot cow-calf example there. A lot of the premium aspect of this, it's going to involve, where your cattle are going, right? So it might be, if your cattle are exchanging hands with someone, hopefully you're rewarded for production practices that are valuable. If you think through traceability as a valuable production practice, then you'd think that's where you get that premium. What do I mean by that? So I'm in Arkansas in the Southeast. So we have a lot of cattle that are, coming out of, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida. Some of them we call Arkansas in a way, kind of like the crossroads for production for cattle. So they might stop in Oklahoma or Western Arkansas and graze something. So they're exchanged hands there potentially. And then they're exchanged hands again before they enter a feedlot. So, ideally, you'd work out some scenario where if you're doing production practices that are valuable, regardless of if they're going to a feedlot or not, the idea and hope and goal is that you're rewarded for those practices, regardless of who's ever paying for them, or I should say, wherever those cattle are being exchanged in terms of ownership. So kind of dancing around the question there, but yeah, that's a hard one.
Yeah, and I like your comment. I'd say there's a lot of feedlots in Nebraska who procure directly to cow-calf operations in Alabama and such, and so if they would still be willing to pay for that premium, even though the cattle are raised in a different location.
Yeah, I'd add too, I think just all of this that we're talking about, it's all a work in progress, but I think what we're all kind of hinting at is this is going to be a very collaborative effort by everyone in the industry, right? So, cow-calf producers, if we want, traceability back to the farm, adoption starts there. Our marketing channel, so our auctions, they're working hard to facilitate these types of programs. Feedlots play their role as well. So in general, the premium aspect of this, but the whole dang thing is going to really take a strong effort from everybody that's involved. And I think we all agree on that.
Yeah, it would. So has there been any thought to the producer having secure control over the information, over what is required by APHIS? So this kind of speaks a little bit to what you were talking about, James, of who's actually going to control the information.
Yeah, so I don't want to speak to specific programs. I'm sure there's probably some people on the call that might be affiliated with some of them, but for example, take the cattle trace program. I am in no way affiliated with this program, but just kind of reading up on their website about it. I think the idea, and one of the nice parts about that, is it's giving some control over that data to producers, right? So maybe the individual producer doesn't manage the data, but there might be more confidence that the people who do have control are producers themselves. So they have all the incentive in the world to protect and determine, what's given out. It becomes trickier in terms of tracing diseases when data is managed that way. What I'd like to see too is kind of, in terms of another potential benefit here, is cow-calf producers are sharing whatever information, through these traceability systems, figuring out ways for producers to benefit from that information. A classic example you'll hear in a talk if you talk about this stuff is, is there any way that, if a cow producer is, using these types of traceability program, can we, potentially share feedlots performance data more efficiently using traceability, stuff like that. So I just gave an example of one specific traceability system that I think is kind of allows more control over the data from a producer perspective. But again, I can't speak to the specifics of that example because I'm not affiliated with it, but I think there is discussion about that out there.
Thank you. Dr. Vander Ley, you take this one. Is there one company that's approved to manufacture and distribute RFID tags, or are there many companies that potentially qualify for this? And then the tag-on question to that is there a industry-wide standard for what information is displayed when reading an NID tag?
So there's actually, I don't know exactly how many companies are approved to manufacture official ID, but there are several. So there's a couple of big ones that are probably known, like Ytex, Allflex, and Datamars are all companies that can produce official ID and can supply those EIDs. And that's not a complete list, I'm sure. I'm sure there are other companies that have those. I think recently the USDA has been purchasing and distributing tags for free distribution within the states. So they're providing those to veterinary practitioners so that they can put them in cattle as kind of a way to subsidize some of this. And I think my understanding of the system is that they're getting a lot of tags from they're buying kind of equal shares from the different companies. There is some standards. I don't know the details of the standards for what those tags display, but they do display a 15-digit, like every official electronic ID displays a 15-digit code. They're called 840 tags. So 840 is the country code for the US. So if we put anything here in the US, it's going to start with 840. And there are a few nuances about that, but most of the time it's going to be a 15-digit number that starts with 840. And there are specs for the tags and things like that. And they do include things like retention studies and some other things, but what you're going to see show up on your reader for a low frequency EID is going to be a 15-digit number that typically starts with 840.
Thank you, Dr. Vander Ley. Just a reminder, if you have questions, continue to submit them, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can live. We're also going to be posting a Q&A question paper that comes out. So even if the question doesn't get directly answered here, we will directly answer it in written format. So Dr. Mitchell, why don't you take this one? You talked pretty much about the cost to quantify the EID tag, but maybe talk a little bit about how you took into account the cost of technology when you're asking cow-calf producers and feedlots, and how did that impact maybe potentially some of the results? One of the primary concerns is, the speed of commerce and, reducing a lot of the animal stress when they're being worked. Maybe talk a little bit about how you took that into account and if any, how that might affect your results.
Yeah, so, one of the things we all do when we're doing research is we have to keep things simple. That's a very important part of all this. Like, the costs of doing all this are a lot more than just the physical tag costs, as you just discussed. Didn't consider any of that in what I was presenting research-wise, just because that would really, really make things hard. But that said, there's some research that I saw by Elliott. You're probably familiar with this. I think some faculty members at K-State put together where they estimated what those additional costs are. I don't have the results to that on hand. If someone specifically wants to know what those are, we can find some way to share those. But there is research out there documenting that the cost is more than just the tag cost, right? There's the shoot charge, there's the labor, there's if you don't have a laptop, you'll need to buy a laptop for some of this stuff. And generally, what the result was, and in economics we call this economies of scale, is the dollar per head total cost of participating in traceability is much smaller for larger operations than it is for, let's say, a herd that's fewer than 50 head, right? So there's certain costs involved with participating in traceability. Those costs decline as your cow herd increases. There's some implications to that, obviously. So yeah, can't say I directly assess that, but there are others that have that we could probably get references for if we need them.
Yeah, thanks, James. And we'll make sure to put a link to that study in the Q&A session. Dr. Vander Ley, why don't you take this one? 2 questions. First, maybe talk about how high frequency tags are implemented. Are they implanted? Are they just in the ear? Kind of maybe talk a little bit how those are used. And then is there any other technology besides RFID tags that's even discussed that would be efficient from an animal health perspective?
Okay, I'll start with the high frequency tag application. So these are still going to be in the form of something that's probably applied to the animal's ear in a button or in a visual tag or some version of that. Implanting anything in food animals is kind of a difficult it's a difficult thing to manage, because as soon as we put something into an animal, we've adulterated the carcass, which makes it ineligible for slaughter. So it'd be the same as breaking off a needle in an animal or something like that. So unless we can recover that reliably in all the pieces of it, that animal isn't really eligible to go into the food chain. So implanting anything is kind of we steer pretty clear of that, because it'll be a food safety issue. The question about other technology, I would say that the focus has definitely been on electronic IDs. Both high and low frequency kind of share the spotlight for the principal technology, but we speculate and brainstorm on occasion. And I've been part of these brainstorms where we talk about things like photo recognition is a potential. There's biometric technology that we can probably use to do a pretty good job of identifying cattle. And the other piece of information that every animal carries with it that's unique to it is its DNA. But those are a bit futuristic, because the technology to do those at scale and at speed are still very much in their most rudimentary stages. So for the time being, I wouldn't expect to hear very much about any of those other than electronic ID.
Dr. Vander Ley, and let's have on these last questions. Let's have Dr. Vander Ley go first, and then we'll have Dr. Mitchell go second. So, how can specifically cow-calf producers maybe leverage this traceability to garner premiums? And then the second question is, what are some ways that maybe we can is the industry moving towards maybe trying to identify some of these attributes such as traceability in cattle? And then kind of where you see that or the industry going in that. And start with Dr. Vander Ley.
All right. So I think the question about premiums is one that we talk about a lot. We talk about this relative to health management and other types of management interventions that we apply to calves and then try to market those. And the issue that we have, and I'm going to let the economists spend more time on this, but cattle are treated as a commodity with some grades. So we grade cattle based on essentially visual information that can be ascertained at market time, and some other kind of peripherals that go with it, like where did they come from, how many did we buy at one time, and how big are they? So when you're dealing with kind of a graded commodity system, getting a premium means trying to, in my mind, means trying to extract yourself from the commodity system. And that means you have to set your animals apart, which involves some marketing effort on your part, whether it's finding a different marketing channel to get them through, or highlighting that value somehow. It's really going to be an effort largely on the part of the cow-calf producer. That being said, that's challenging. I don't have a lot of great ideas for how to do that. What I do think is possible for cow-calf producers is, rather than, like, in addition maybe to focusing on the premiums, to focus on the opportunities to use the facets of traceability to improve their own system. So capturing information about performance and other types of production measures that allow you to improve your productivity, to make your system more resilient and more productive, and to make sure that each unit of production, be it a cow or a calf, is really performing at its best for you, using the technology associated with traceability, offers a tremendous potential to capture value without depending on anyone else to do it. So you don't have to try to extract some value from someone else. You create the value yourself based on enhancing your system's productivity using that technology. And that takes some self-education, it takes some creativity, and it's a little different for every system. Shifting the mindset is another kind of an interesting question, because the mindset is a very, there's a lot of work that's been done on how innovation, if we want to call this technology or traceability innovation, diffuses through populations of people. And as we create awareness, there's a pretty standard set of stages it goes through, and those just take time. So our best effort is to create awareness, try to create our own value, and then we sort of have to wait for it to incubate. That's my opinion. Certainly welcome corrections and comments from Dr. Mitchell, who knows more about it. I'm out of my wheelhouse now. So
much as you say that was as good of an answer as I could ever hope of producing myself. Basically, what I think we're talking about here is, if you already have to, let's say, if you're going to already do traceability, why not extract as much usefulness out of it as you can, right? So if you're going to use electronic traceability, why not use it to like manage your herd health records, your herd genetics, stuff like that, is part of that, right? So if you're going to use something, let's use all of it. Extracting other types of information, performance information for feedlots is good. The aspect of marketing this stuff, I know this is not the same thing at all, but there was a time where other programs that are pretty prevalent now were new as well. So FACT 45 wasn't always a thing. There's lots of other value-added programs that weren't always a thing that we can maybe learn from. It does take a lot of relationship building to potentially extract value for your cattle, right? So, where are you selling them? Auction, video auction, private treaty, stuff like that. It generally will take some relationship building to really realize all that value. That's just adding on to an already really nice answer from Dr. Vander Ley.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Vander Ley. I really appreciated being with us today and joining us. And thank you, everyone who's participated in the webinar today. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be posted at farm.unl.edu, where you can also view the slides as well. And you can also register for other upcoming webinars. Next week is the second of our monthly series geared towards helping producers better understand their finances. And it will also start at noon Central Daylight Time, and we'll focus on understanding costs of production. Shortly, you'll be receiving a quick survey in your email. We'd really appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. Input for future sessions is also, as well as things that we can do to improve or continue to do. Thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you back here next week.